Okay, this game. Today on Ancient DOS Games, we're taking a look back at a game I have a bit of a history with. King's Quest III: To Err as Human. This was one of the earliest games we ever got for our Tandy 1000 computer back in the 80s, and it also has the distinction of being the first game I ever had my father return to the store, because as a kid with a single-digit age, I couldn't even remotely figure out what I was supposed to be doing. Now, compared to the original King's Quest, which had lots of exploration and was open-ended with multiple solutions to most puzzles, this third game was incredibly frustrating in terms of how easy it was to die, how little there was to explore, how I was constantly being forced to do chores or being punished for not doing them, and then as soon as I felt like I was making any kind of progress, suddenly I'd just be arbitrarily executed. I just couldn't figure out how to even remotely have any semblance of fun, and so I just gave up after only a couple days of trying. Approaching this game now as an adult, what I find curious is that the game isn't as bad as I remembered it being, but only because I have a better grasp of what's going on, the mechanics in play, and how to actually make any progress. But don't get me wrong, the game will still kill you at the drop of a hat just because it feels like it, and it hides certain things in ways which I would consider to be user hostile, and has a handful of inconsistent moments with its text parsing. So the game is still frustrating, but it's mitigated by having greater problem-solving skills and by being able to recognize how its internal mechanics are working. That said, I think what surprised me the most, though, is that for a game which has a massive number of inventory items to acquire, you use surprisingly few of them directly to solve problems, as the majority of them are meant to be ingredients towards preparing and casting magical spells. Also, some parts of the game are timed to real time, thus why such a clock appears at the top of the screen to track how much real time has passed in your playthrough, not counting all of the reloading you're likely going to be doing. King's Quest III was originally released near the end of 1986 by Sierra Online, and is once again a one-player inventory-based adventure. It supports all of the common 80s video modes, including 16-color composite CGA output, and supports both the PC speaker and Tandy 3-voice chipset for audio. As for its current release date, you have a number of options if you'd like a copy nowadays, depending on what your end goal is. Now, if you just want to play the game quickly and easily, then your best bet is to grab a digital download. On GOG, you can get the first 3 King's Quest games for $10, and on Steam, you can get the original 7 King's Quest adventure games for $20. However, to pay less per game, your better option may be to go for a physical copy of a collection CD. Now, keeping in mind that the King's Quest collection, released in 2006, does not include the original AGI version of the first King's Quest game, only the updated SCI version. But yeah, the collection CDs typically go for around $15 and give you all of the same games as a $20 collection on Steam. However, if you want a physical copy of the original game, it's not hard to find, but now you'll be spending a bit more money. Original physical copies tend to be found fully boxed and sell for around the $50 mark, give or take depending on condition, with the discs alone typically going for around half of that, between $20 and $25. You do have to keep a few things in mind though, the most important being that while the game was primarily made for DOS, there were ports to several other computers, and the discs and boxes don't look all that different between them all, so you need to scrutinize any listings you come across to be certain you're looking at a copy for the exact system you want it for. Not to mention, copies for all systems other than DOS tend to be harder to find and more expensive, sometimes crossing into triple digits, though only for the most pristine and rarest copies out there. One last thing to keep in mind too, specifically if you want to get the collection CDs, is that there's also a release known as King's Quest: The Complete Collection, which is actually the modern reboot of the King's Quest series, which was originally done episodically but then compiled together into one package. That's an entirely different thing compared to the original games, as they're all new stories told within the same universe and lore. But just be aware it exists so that you don't end up buying that thinking it's a collection of the original games, when in fact, it's not. King's Quest III takes place quite a number of years after the events of the first two games, and at first glance, doesn't seem like it has anything to do with them. There is a connection, quite a significant one, but I'm going to do my best not to spoil it for anyone who hasn't yet played these games. The backstory the player is given for this experience is that in a distant land known as Elidor lives an evil wizard known as Manannan, whose goals and ambitions are never really revealed. However, being an evil wizard, he finds the idea of doing menial chores repulsive and would rather spend his time in more productive ways. To that end, he decided one day to kidnap a baby boy and raise the boy as a slave to his whims. However, as the boy got older, he began to clue into what was going on and started to poke around in the wizard's dealings, and one day when Manannan discovered the boy practicing a magic spell, he decided to just end the boy's life then and there. Realizing the mistake, Manannan made a new rule for his future slaves: raise them to the age of 18, then replace them, as in kill the old one and find a new one. After decades of this macabre routine, Manannan eventually ends up with a boy by the name of Gwydion, and nearing the eve of Gwydion's 18th birthday, this becomes the young man you take command of as the player, as a new day of chores and servitude to the evil wizard begins. Just like with most everything else made with Sierra's adventure game interpreter engine, the main gameplay is very simple, using the numeric keypad to walk around, and then typing into the text parser the different actions you want to take. One thing I did notice though is that the AGI engine is a little more advanced by this point, and recognizes numeric keypad inputs for movement regardless of the state of numlock. Unlike earlier games where if numlock was on, the numeric keypad would just type numbers into the text parser. However, the first major deviation from a typical AGI title is the timer up at the top of the screen. This timer functions entirely in real time, keeping track of how long your game has been going for, but what's important to note is that there are indeed timed events in this game. Specifically, the wizard Manannan follows a bit of a rough schedule for his activities, and certain trigger points will start real-time countdowns before additional things will happen. Because this timer is in real time though, it means adjusting the speed of the gameplay can actually give you more or less time to work with for getting things done, since you can travel around faster or slower. This timer though is kind of a double-edged sword. In one sense, it does give the game some semblance of urgency, in that if you know how long you have to get certain things done, it may prompt you to adjust what you're doing accordingly so as not to run afoul of the timer, but it can also end up having the opposite effect. For instance, Manannan goes on trips which last around 20 to 25 minutes once during every hour of real time. During those trips, he holds no control over you, thus you're able to explore to your heart's content until he returns. The trouble is that one of the first things you're likely going to want to do is dispose of the evil wizard once and for all. But if you end up ready to do that while the wizard's only 10 minutes into a trip, you now have to wait up to 15 minutes of real time before you can finally proceed. And a similar thing happens with the pirates later on, as once you're taken captive by the pirates, it takes about 10 minutes of real time before they spot land, but it only really takes about 2 to 3 minutes to see and do everything you need to do on the pirate ship, meaning once you do all of that, you're now stuck waiting for that timer to count down. One of the other key mechanics in place has to do with the sheer quantity of items that you're able to acquire, most of which are considered ingredients for spellcasting. Manannan has a keen eye and will notice if Gwydion has anything on his person that would suggest he is dabbling in magic. Thus, if at any point in time Manannan appears and any of the items in your inventory have an asterisk next to them, that's a game over for you. But fortunately, because Manannan doesn't like to get anywhere near dirt and grime, he never enters Gwydion's bedroom. Thus, you can hide your items under your bed to keep them from the wizard's gaze. Plus, you can either hide or retrieve your entire inventory all at once, or hide or retrieve specific items by name. In terms of getting rid of Manannan, that is almost certainly what your first goal of the game should be. I mean, cripes, if you don't do your chores within 3 minutes of being asked, Manannan will punish you in one of 4 ways, either by locking you in your room, forcing you to exercise, hanging you up to dry in the kitchen, or turning you into a snail. However, when Manannan is asleep or away, that's when it's time to get into gear and figure out how you're going to escape your fate. This brings us to one of the first moments of the game being truly asinine. The brass key. Now, the brass key is easy enough to find, it just happens to be sitting on top of Manannan's closet in his bedroom. I mean, you can clearly see it there, right? No? Well, guess what? Neither can Gwydion. If you go up to the closet and look at it, as most AGI games teach you to do in order to learn about things by being up close and investigating them, as far as the game is concerned, there isn't even a hint of anything special going on. However, if you step away from the closet and look at it with some distance, then you will get a message indicating something is on top. Again, you can clearly see it there, right? Yeah, this is not the only instance of this game pulling sneaky tricks like this. The next is the cat. You need cat fur for one of the spells, but anytime you try to pick up Manannan's cat, it'll just escape from your grasp. Except no, about 1 in every 5 tries will succeed, and you'll now have the cat in your arms. This isn't puzzle solving, it's just repeating the same failed action until it succeeds on dumb luck. The worst, though, are the acorns. One of the spells you can conjure up requires dried acorns as an ingredient, but when you go to pluck some acorns fallen from this tree, it'll say, and I quote, "These are all newly fallen," giving the impression that none of the acorns are dried. Yet if you persevere and continue walking around this tree and continue attempting to pick up acorns, eventually you will indeed find some dry ones, even though, again, the game is continually telling you they are all newly fallen. Not just most of them, every one of them. And you know how many tries it actually took me to get dried acorns from this tree? Freaking 38 attempts. Why, just freaking why did they make it so incredibly luck dependent on getting dried acorns? Now granted, this is for one of the spells I don't think you need to win the game, but it certainly makes things easier when it does come into play. The game is also not shy about killing Gwydion instantly and without warning. This path through the mountains to get to and from your house is incredibly annoying, and I remember falling in it a ton as a kid. But as an adult, I didn't actually find it all that difficult anymore. Though this particular mountainside here, which you're expected to climb, was at first not letting me climb it, and then when it finally did let me up, it just instantly threw me to my demise for whatever reason. Actually, I think this is a legitimate bug and not me being dumb, because when I was ready to leave the pirate ship, I figured I could just walk off the side, but it wouldn't let me. So I typed in a command to jump off, and it said I should just walk off. But I can't just walk off. I've tried that multiple times now. Okay, now it suddenly works, even though I didn't do anything different? But yeah, most of the time, if there's an insta-kill of some sort, the game makes it pretty obvious what you did wrong. For instance, every screen of the Western Desert has a Medusa, which is guaranteed to show up. And if you're looking in its general direction, you will immediately turn to stone, even if the Medusa had only just appeared. So the trick is to enter the desert and immediately look east. Then get ready with the wizard's pocket mirror to trick Medusa into looking at herself to turn herself into stone. And heck, this is one of the very few instances in the game where you use an inventory item directly to solve a problem, as opposed to as an ingredient for casting spells. The other annoying insta-kill is when you're going down into the wizard's secret basement where all his magic supplies and instruments are kept, as every once in a while, the cat will be standing in the midst of the stairs, and if you try to squeeze by, you are guaranteed to trip and plummet to your doom. And heck, if you do this after gaining the ability to understand the speech of animals, the cat will even make a joke about it at your expense. But yeah, down in this basement is where the magic happens, both figuratively and literally, as in order to successfully escape the wizard's clutches and beat the game, you need to perform some spellcasting of your own. However, you'd better hope you have the manual handy because despite the game originally having disk-based copy protection, none of the spellcasting steps are written down anywhere in the game itself. The manual not only serves to explain the basic gameplay, but it also lists the 7 spells you're able to cast in the game and their methods of preparation and activation. A spell to understand the language of creatures, a spell to fly like an eagle or insect, a spell of random teleportation, a spell to put people into a deep sleep, a spell to forever transform another into a cat, a spell to both cause and clear storms, and a spell to become invisible. Of particular note early in the game is that spell to transform another into a cat, since not counting the magic wand, which is needed for every spell, it only has 3 ingredients. Cat hair, which you can pluck from Manannan's cat, mandrake root powder, which is right there on the shelves, and fish oil, which you can buy from the shopkeeper in town once you find some money. To begin the process, you need to approach the spellbook in the basement and turn to the page indicated for the spell in the manual. Then, you need to input every single step verbatim. Every word, every line, all of it, without any mistakes. The only saving grace is that capitalization and punctuation don't matter. But beyond that, make even the tiniest typo, and the spell will backfire onto yourself in some manner, resulting in a game over. Unfortunately, the result of the cat transformation spell is a cookie which needs to be eaten to become a cat. And it is very obviously not a normal cookie, thus there's no way you would ever be able to get Manannan to eat it directly. However, as with other King's Quest titles, there are references to various fairy tales strewn throughout, and here in the 3rd game in particular, we fittingly have a reference to Goldilocks and the 3 Bears. Now, you could go into their house and sit in their chairs and sleep in their beds, just like in the fairy tale, and the bears will ultimately get home and toss you out. But when it comes to their porridge, instead of eating the porridge, you can instead take some of it with you and then crumble up the cat cookie into the porridge to make for quite a spicy cat ball. But yeah, the next time Manannan demands food, which is guaranteed to be immediately once you've put this tainted meal together, just serve it to him and he will forever become a cat, freeing you from his tyranny and opening up the rest of the game. And then this is when you're going to realize that, yeah, the game really does just come down to finding all of the ingredients, making all of the spells, and using them in the right moments to advance the plot until you win. There's really not much more to the game other than being a glorified scavenger hunt, though there are a few more things I do want to elaborate on. For starters, as far as I'm aware, you only really need 4 of the 7 spells to win the game. The cat cookie to deal with Manannan, the flight spell to deal with the spider blocking access to the cave where the oracle resides, and then both the storm and invisibility spells to deal with the final encounter right before you win. The teleportation spell is nice to have and can act as a shortcut in the later sections of the game without having to find your way around some of the strange mountain paths you're expected to climb. The sleep spell is useful for getting away from the pirates, but I don't believe it's necessary. And the spell for understanding the speech of animals is only really necessary for getting a maximum score, and otherwise mostly just serves to deliver flavor text, as once you have the spell created, every time you enter a screen with 2 or more of the same kind of animals present, there's about a 25% chance that they'll have a little conversation within the first few seconds, with there being a pool of possible conversations for each pairing of animals possible, regardless of which screens they show up on. Another thing I want to elaborate on is that this game takes a slightly different approach to scoring than previous games. I remember before when I made an ADG Pro video on the original King's Quest, and I elaborated on how the score was based on a combination of events and whether certain items were present in your inventory or not. Well, here in King's Quest 3, scoring is only based on events and having found certain items at all. Losing an item from your inventory does not affect your score in any way. Because of this, and because of how very linear the game is when it comes down to it, going for a maximum score really isn't all that hard. And mind you, I completely miss the presence of a magic map, because again, it's an item you're never going to know exists without going above and beyond the expectations set from the descriptions being given to you as you play. The last thing I want to comment on, though, is an extreme gripe I have with the spellcasting mechanic. Which, yes, is already a chore to perform in its own right, since all you're doing is typing in many sentences worth of things which are already written down in the manual, and then having to do it all over again if you make the smallest mistake, except there is one exception to this process. When preparing the invisibility spell, the second step, as indicated in the manual, is measure a spoon of cactus juice. Yet if you type these exact words into the game, It tells you that it doesn't understand the word measure. This is the only instance in the entire spellcasting sequence where one of the things you're supposed to type in from the manual doesn't work. And worse still, because of how this line is written, it's not easy trying to come up with an alternate thing to say which relates the exact same command. After a bunch of attempts, it turns out the command, which worked for me, was squeeze cactus juice onto spoon. Which is already a bit of a misnomer because how the heck are you supposed to squeeze a cactus plant without impaling your hand with needles? Overall, King's Quest III isn't as bad as I remember it being, but it's definitely not as good as the first two King's Quest games, at least in terms of raw gameplay. Actually, even the story is pretty thin, as it's mostly just lumped together as 3 key lore dumps at the start, the middle, and the end. Couple that with some of the leaps of logic the game forces you to make, and some of the insane repetition required to make progress, and really, this comes across as a unique but flawed experience, at least for the time, given that we are talking mid-80s, so there still weren't a lot of precedents set yet in terms of graphical adventures on DOS computers. But even me, back as a single-digit age, knew something was up with this game, and it just wasn't up to the same standards. Nowadays, this game is primarily for fans of the King's Quest series or fans of adventure games, and if that's not you, then save yourself the frustration and play something else. As with other Sierra AGI titles, you want to leave cycle set to auto and set the machine type to Tandy in order to get the enhanced Tandy 3-voice sound. And if you want to use a joystick or gamepad for whatever reason, you need to turn off timed intervals. Though given the extreme precision you need to survive some of the mountain mazes presented here, I would highly recommend using the keyboard for movement instead. Anywho, that'll be all for today's episode of Ancient DOS Games. Sorry it's a week late, but my abdomen decided in a rather painful way that I was going to be mostly useless for an equivalent amount of time. But now that that's over with, we're getting right back into the swing of things. Thus, 2 Saturdays from now, on August 16th, will be another Standard Review, episode 346, where we're going to be taking a look at a game where if you get a game over, the entirety of New York City goes thermonuclear. And I have a funny feeling whatever game you think this is going to be, it's not. So be sure to stay tuned to see which game it is which has such a cataclysmic end for failing to succeed. Thanks for watching, everyone, and extra special thanks to everyone supporting me over on Patreon. If you'd also like to support the show directly and get some extra perks, then head on over to patreon.com/KASICK.